It was an ordinary morning in court, or so everyone thought. The courtroom buzzed quietly as lawyers shuffled papers and the judge flipped through his docket. This was Judge Harold Bronson's domain, a man known for his no-nonsense attitude and sharp tongue. To him, justice was a game of logic, not emotion, a battle of wits, not heart. Then she walked in. Claire Donovan wasn't like the polished attorneys or the seasoned clerks who regularly graced the courtroom. At just 17 years old, she was visibly nervous, clutching a small stack of papers to her chest. Her worn shoes clicked awkwardly against the tiled floor as she approached the stand. Her presence was so unexpected that the murmur in the room ceased, and all eyes turned to her. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Miss Donovan," he said, his voice dripping with skepticism, "you're here to represent yourself?" Claire's hands trembled slightly, but she nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, I am." A faint chuckle rippled through the courtroom, soft but unmistakable, like the sound of rain hitting a window pane. It came from the rows of suited attorneys seated behind Claire, their expressions a mix of amusement and curiosity. This scene was far from ordinary, and everyone knew it. Cases like this, led by a teenager no less, were the stuff of fiction, not the stark reality of Judge Harold Bronson's courtroom. The judge adjusted his glasses, the metal frames catching the dull light overhead. He leaned back in his chair, his expression hovering somewhere between boredom and irritation. His voice, low and deliberate, broke the growing tension in the room. "And what case, pray tell, brings you to my courtroom today?" Claire Donovan, clutching her bundle of papers as though it were her armor, took a deep breath. The weight of every gaze in the room pressed against her, but she refused to waver. Her voice, though steady, carried the slightest quiver, betraying her nerves. "I'm here to challenge the city's decision to close Oakwood Community Center." A murmur swept through the audience, a ripple of whispers and exchanged glances. Oakwood, many had heard of it, but few knew the depth of its importance. Judge Bronson, however, did not seem impressed. He sighed deeply, a sound that echoed like a gavel striking wood. "Miss Donovan," he began, his tone sharp enough to cut through her resolve, "this is a courtroom, not a high school debate club. I hope you understand the seriousness of—" Before he could finish, Claire lifted her chin, a spark of defiance lighting her eyes. She didn't wait for permission. She spoke, her voice suddenly firmer, louder, and unshakable. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I understand perfectly." The room seemed to hold its breath as she continued. "The center isn't just a building. It's a lifeline for hundreds of families, including mine, and I'm here because someone has to speak for them." There it was, that undeniable conviction that had driven her to stand here today, against all odds. Her words weren't polished, nor were they delivered with the practiced poise of a seasoned attorney, but they had something else: truth. It wasn't just a plea, it was a declaration, a refusal to let the people who relied on Oakwood fade into the margins of legal documents and budget cuts. For a moment, the courtroom was still. The judge, usually so quick to dismiss anything he deemed frivolous, hesitated. His gavel, poised for action, remained unused. There was something in her voice, a raw determination that cut through the procedural haze of the courtroom and struck at the very heart of what justice was supposed to mean. The silence was deafening, yet electric. It was as though the very walls of the courtroom had leaned in to listen. And Claire, with her trembling hands and unyielding spirit, stood at the center of it all, ready to fight for more than just a building, ready to fight for hope itself. The judge's lips pressed into a thin, skeptical line, a clear sign of his reservations. "Proceed," he said curtly, gesturing with a dismissive wave of his hand. His tone carried an unspoken challenge. "Prove to me that this is worth my time." Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped closer to the podium, gripping its edges like a lifeline. She drew in a deep breath, her nerves threatening to choke her resolve. But then she thought of the faces that had brought her here. The mothers, the children, the elderly who depended on Oakwood Community Center, and the fear gave way to purpose. She began to speak, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger with each word. "Your Honor, Oakwood isn't just a building, it's a refuge, a lifeline, a place where lives are rebuilt, one day at a time. She described the single mothers, exhausted from working 2 or 3 jobs, who found affordable childcare at Oakwood. Without it, they'd have to choose between earning a living and caring for their children. She spoke about the elderly, many of whom had no family nearby, finding companionship and dignity in Oakwood's programs. And then there were the students, struggling kids who found not just tutors, but mentors who believed in them when no one else did. As Claire painted this vivid picture, her voice took on a rhythm, a steady cadence that drew the room into her world. For the families she spoke of, Oakwood wasn't just a community center. It was a safety net, a beacon of hope in a world that often forgot about the vulnerable. At first, Judge Bronson appeared indifferent. He tapped his pen against the desk, glanced at his watch, and adjusted the papers before him. But as Claire continued, something shifted. Her words carried a quiet power, and even the most hardened cynic in the room couldn't ignore it. The judge's pen stilled in his hand, his watch forgotten. His once dismissive gaze began to soften, his eyes now following her every move. And then Claire's voice faltered, just for a moment. She paused, visibly swallowing back emotion, before continuing. "My little brother," she said, her voice cracking slightly, "wouldn't have learned to read if it weren't for the volunteers at Oakwood. They didn't just teach him letters and words, they gave him a chance to dream beyond the limits of our circumstances." She hesitated again, her hands tightening around the podium. "And my mom, she works 2 jobs just to keep us afloat. If it weren't for Oakwood, she wouldn't have had the support to make it through some of our hardest days. This place isn't just brick and mortar, it's hope. And hope doesn't belong on a balance sheet." The room was silent. Even the faint rustling of papers had ceased. Claire's words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. The people in the courtroom weren't just hearing about Oakwood, they were seeing it through her eyes, feeling its impact through her voice. Judge Bronson sat motionless, his stern exterior beginning to crack. The skepticism that had marked his every word was fading, replaced by something else. Was it empathy? Respect? Perhaps even guilt for having dismissed her so quickly. Claire's voice softened, but her conviction remained unyielding. "I know I can't change the world, Your Honor," she said, her eyes meeting his. "But I can fight to save this one corner of it. Because for the people who rely on Oakwood, this isn't just a building, it's a lifeline they can't afford to lose." The courtroom, once skeptical of this young girl's presence, now seemed captivated by her words. Claire wasn't just speaking for herself, she was giving a voice to the voiceless, a chance for their stories to be heard, in a place that rarely made room for them. And as she stood there, unwavering, even the most jaded hearts in the room couldn't help but wonder if perhaps justice wasn't about rules alone. Perhaps, as Claire had shown them, it was also about compassion. Tears welled in Claire's eyes, blurring her vision. She bit her lip, trying to steady herself, but the emotions she'd been holding back were overwhelming. This moment felt impossibly big, too big for her small frame, too heavy for her young shoulders. The weight of the lives she was fighting for bore down on her, yet she refused to falter. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that wasn't just quiet, but reverent. Even the attorneys, many of whom had walked these halls for decades, sat frozen. The whispers of skepticism that had accompanied her earlier had vanished, replaced by an air of solemnity. People leaned forward in their seats, hanging on her every word. Claire swallowed hard and continued, her voice trembling but clear. "I'm not here because I think I can change everything, Your Honor. I'm here because I believe every life matters. The families, the kids, the seniors, they deserve more than a line item on a budget report. They deserve someone to stand up for them." When she finished, she exhaled shakily and lifted her gaze to Judge Bronson. Her eyes, red and glistening with unshed tears, locked onto his. Her expression was an unusual mix, pleading, yes, but also defiant. There was no apology in her stance, no wavering in her belief. "I know I'm young," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence like a whisper in a church. "And maybe you think I don't belong here. But if I don't speak for these people, who will?" The judge, a man who had presided over countless cases and seen nearly every kind of plea imaginable, stared at her. His face, as practiced and unreadable as ever, betrayed no clear emotion, but there it was, a flicker in his eyes. Guilt? Admiration? Even he might not have been sure. He cleared his throat, a small gesture that seemed almost too human for the towering authority he represented. "Miss Donovan," he began, his voice softer now, the sharp edges dulled. "I must admit you've surprised me. Your argument, it's compelling, but the law is not built on sentiment. It requires justice," Claire interrupted, her voice firm and unyielding. She stepped closer to the podium, her knuckles white as she gripped its edge. "And justice is about people, not just rules on a page." The boldness of her words sent a ripple through the room. For a moment, even the judge seemed taken aback. The Claire who had walked into this courtroom was no longer the timid girl they had underestimated. She was a fighter, standing toe-to-toe with the system itself. For a moment, the air seemed to stand still. Judge Bronson studied Claire, not as a child out of her depth, but as something else, a force to be reckoned with. Her passion, her conviction, it was undeniable. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady, and for the first time, a flicker of respect crossed his face. He nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly, as though coming to terms with the reality before him. "I'll take your case under advisement," he said at last, his tone measured but no longer dismissive. The words hung in the air like a lifeline, fragile yet powerful. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a crack in the wall, a chance, however small, for Claire to be heard. Claire's lips parted slightly in surprise. Relief flooded her, but so did determination. She nodded back, her voice steady as she replied, "Thank you, Your Honor. That's all I ask." Her words carried weight, and they lingered long after she stepped back from the podium. The courtroom began to stir again, murmurs breaking the silence, but the energy had shifted. This wasn't just a routine case anymore. As Claire gathered her papers and walked out of the courtroom, her steps felt lighter, yet her resolve only grew. She knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but she wasn't afraid. Behind her, Judge Bronson sat quietly, staring at the empty space where she had stood. The courtroom buzzed with the usual noises of shuffled papers and quiet conversations, but his mind was elsewhere. Her words, "Justice is about people," echoed in his thoughts, planting a seed that refused to be ignored. In that moment something shifted. Not just in the judge but in everyone who had been in that room. Claire had reminded them of something they'd long forgotten. Justice isn't just about rules, it's about heart. And sometimes it takes the courage of a young girl to remind the world of what truly matters. As she left the courtroom, the air seemed to crackle with energy. Whispers followed her. Admiration, curiosity, disbelief. Claire Donovan, the 17-year-old girl who dared to argue against the odds, had made her mark. And Judge Bronson? He sat alone at his bench, staring at the empty room long after everyone had gone. Somewhere deep within him, a seed had been planted. A reminder that justice isn't just about laws, it's about humanity. Claire's case would indeed change history. But for now, it had already changed one man's heart. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more inspiring content like this, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. What part of this story touched you the most? Let us know in the comments below. And if you think this story could inspire someone else, please share it with your friends and family. Together, we can spread positivity and make a difference. Thank you for being part of our journey.